Why is a story like mine of being held hostage for 460 days so resonant with people? I mean, most people, thankfully, will never go through a similar situation. But it's the themes that I'm going to be talking about today that are universal. I mean, who among us doesn't know the experience of hopelessness, of being totally overwhelmed, of despair? I mean, we all go through it. And if life has not yet brought you to your knees, you're lucky, congratulations, but it probably will, because that's just the normal trajectory of the human experience. So what we know about resilience, it matters. It matters a lot, and it matters now in 2024 more than ever, which I don't really need to tell you, because as brokers and as entrepreneurs, this is not probably the easiest time to be in your business. And it's during these kind of challenging times that having a shift in your mindset, finding some fresh perspective that can sometimes come through hearing other people's stories, that can make a huge difference to the ultimate outcome of how you emerge from these difficult times. The story that I'm going to share with you today, I mean, it's a big dramatic story. And I don't share some of the more difficult elements of that story lightly. I certainly don't share them for entertainment. Everything that I share with you today has been really carefully considered and weighed, but I think it is important to share something of the depth of the experiences that I have gone through so that you can appreciate. How have I come to this conclusion that all challenges can become assets? They had taken thick metal chains and wound those around my ankles, secured that with 2 padlocks. I could no longer sit up. I couldn't even lie on my back. I could just lie on my one side on the floor for 24 hours a day. My life was all of a sudden reduced to not even just the size of the room that I was being held in, just to this one spot on this mat on the floor. I was forbidden to speak or to make any noise at all. I was allowed to use the washroom now exactly and only 5 times a day for 3 minutes, timed with a stopwatch. But I always had those leg shackles on. They never came off. So it wasn't easy to move quickly. It wasn't easy to move at all, but you wouldn't want to be late. I remember feeling like I had lost everything. I didn't see the sky again for almost a year. I never laughed once. Even if I could only touch on that resilient part of myself for a moment, it got stronger. It became easier to visit that part of myself over time. And because I was choosing that again and again and again, eventually, I could really ride those resilience spirals that would take me upward into a hopeful place of, yes, one day this will be over. One day I will be with my family again. And in those upward spirals, remembering there's still beauty out there waiting for me. It was never easy to do it. It got easier, but it was never easy. But it was always a choice. And when you're in the difficult days, it can be difficult to have that kind of perspective. But it is so important to keep that big picture in view and to stay focused on that. Because all of the things that you do now influence that big picture. All of the choices that you make will influence how that turns up. It's much more difficult and uncommon to try to pay attention to what is emerging, from the ashes, to turn your attention there. But the more that you do that, the more you can see possibilities. When difficult things happen, usually there's an end point. The bad thing finishes, or it becomes something else. There's some kind of transition, and at some point it becomes an experience in our past. And all that we're really left with of that experience is the story of what happened to us. The story that we tell other people, the words that we use, the emotion behind it. But even more importantly, it's the story we tell ourselves about the things that happen. And we continue to give life to these unwanted negative experiences for years sometimes for a lifetime, when we just perpetually spin in the negative aspects of that. But that doesn't help us at all if we actually want to evolve and we want to move forward. The purpose of life is to grow and evolve and learn. And challenges are where you often find that. So when I really reflected deeply on that, were there any gifts in that for me? Well, yes, there was, actually. And that is also the truth. Because I had my freedom taken away from me, I now know the experience of freedom. There's always two perspectives that we get to choose from as it relates to the things that happen to us in our life. That life happens to you, in which case you're always the victim, maybe sometimes the benefactor of circumstance. Or the one that I choose is that all of life happens for you, the good and the bad. That there's something inherent there for you, for your growth. Being flexible enables resilience. If you're flexible, then almost anything can come your way, and you know that you can adjust, you can adapt, you can pivot, and you can allow resilience to carry you much more easily than if you're dig your heels in and you're stuck and attached to a specific outcome. I kept wanting my life to go back to the way it was. And I think that can be common when you go through something difficult. You want it to go back there. But it won't. No. It's going to go forward, but it's going to go forward in a new way and down a new path, in a new direction. And you're going to go down that path a little stronger and a little wiser from the challenges that reoriented you that way. So being flexible is an incredible resource. It's a very innovative solution when the old ways aren't working for you anymore. Remaining present, especially during high stress situations, that is your seat of power. So in my case, in interactions with my nasty kidnappers, or for you all, in negotiations or in dealing with clients, being present is what enables human connection. Your calm presence is an anchor for others. You have so much more influence over outcomes when you are present. And being present simply is, in my mind, being with what is right in front of you, right now. And I believe, because I have experienced it, that there is no human experience, I believe, that we can't transform into the opposite of it. I've had a lot of experiences in my life, and I feel that transformation, that is the ultimate. When you can turn something dark into something light, when you can turn challenges into growth, you're an alchemist. There's some kind of magic there that happens. And the greatest transformation will come from the most difficult journeys. And that is the real value in those difficult experiences. It's the invaluable wisdom that you get when you go through difficult things. But you don't get the wisdom just because you've gone through some difficult things. Like, it doesn't work quite like that. No, you have to go deep. You have to go deep, and you have to find for yourself what the lessons are. And then you get to go out into the world and use them. And the wisdom that you get from all the challenges that life presents to you, that wisdom, that's your legacy. That's what you can pass on. That's what you can give others. And in both life and in business, we are going to be tested in ways that we could never expect to be. And that is when we get to discover how capable we are. So I'm up here right now. I'm not just someone who has survived something difficult. I am someone who has learned that pushing forward, even when everything seems lost, it's a choice. And it's a choice to show up every single day in your life, ready to adapt, ready to grow, ready to learn. The flexibility that you have, endurance, your resilience, these are your greatest assets. And whatever challenges come your way, trust that you already have everything you need to keep moving forward and to succeed. My story begins in my hometown, which is a place called Red Deer in central Alberta, Canada. Growing up in Red Deer, traveling was not something that my family did any of. We had no money for that. My mom was a cashier at our local grocery store, the Food City, making minimum wage. So extra money in our house was really hard to come by. My older brother, Mark, and I used to, after school, go down back alleys looking for garbage dumpsters, fishing around in those dumpsters for whatever treasures we could find. Mostly we were looking for empty bottles, because those we could take into the bottle depot. I could get a couple of coins, which I could take into my favorite place in the world, which was a used bookstore. And there I could buy some old back issue copies of National Geographic magazine. I kept a big stack of them beside my bed, and when things in my childhood household got ugly, as they often did, there was a lot of violence in the house, I would turn to my treasured magazines. And the images that I saw on those pages of a world that was out there somewhere, an exotic and beautiful and colorful place that frankly looked a little bit different than Red Deer, it really beckoned me from a young age. And when I graduated high school and I set out into the world, I went first to Calgary, which is one of the nearest big cities to where I grew up, and I started working. I wanted to fulfill my dream of traveling, and so I was working around the clock. University didn't seem like much of an option for somebody with a poor family background like mine, so I was waitressing and I was saving all of the tips that I earned until I had saved enough to take my first trip. I took a 6-week trip to Venezuela, which for me was really all the affirmation that I needed, that the world really was an accessible place, even for somebody with a background like mine, and that's really all that I needed to keep going. And so through my early 20s, that's what I did. I would work and save, and then I would travel, and I traveled to over 50 countries. I was usually by myself. I always had my well-worn backpack on, and I was learning how to get by on what we'd call a shoestring budget, $10 a day in places like India and around Southeast Asia. I was having a lot of fun and adventures as I traveled. I went up to Everest Base Camp, and I went diving in the Red Sea, and went on a safari in Africa. I was also trying to do some good as I traveled, volunteering here and there, spending a period of time in Calcutta, India, volunteering for one of Mother Teresa's missions. And when I would run out of money, I really had no choice but to go back home to Calgary and again rent a shoebox-size apartment and start working and saving and planning my next adventure. I am 36 years old now, and it surprises even me looking back on those years at the courage, or whatever else you might want to call it, that I had to go to some of those countries as a woman alone. I went to places like Bangladesh and Pakistan and parts of the Middle East and Africa. I suppose in my 20s, as many do, I felt a bit invincible. I thought nothing bad would happen to me. I certainly believed about the world what the world was showing me to be true, and nothing bad, nothing really bad had ever happened to me. In fact, I was finding it to be true that people have a lot more in common than they do differences, and that people everywhere generally want the same things. They want to be safe. They want to be educated. They want opportunities. They want to be able to provide for their families. When I was 24, I went to Africa for the first time, and this trip really changed the course of my life. I found myself in Ethiopia, and I met an Australian photographer there. His name, Nigel Brennan. He was living the same lifestyle that I was. He was traveling all the time, but for him there was a deeper purpose and meaning to his travels. Because as a journalist, as a photographer, he was sharing the stories that he was encountering on his travels with his community back at home. And I was inspired by that because as a young woman, as I traveled, I was always asking myself how I could make some sort of a difference in the world. And I never really knew the answer to that. But after meeting Nigel, I thought, well, journalism, maybe that could be my answer. And so when I finished that trip to Africa and I found myself broke again back at home in Calgary, Canada, I enrolled in a short journalism course. I was working all the while so that I could take myself out into the world as a new journalist and buy myself a fancy, expensive camera. And after about a year, I had managed to do that. And I bought my plane ticket. I was on my way to Afghanistan, where I was bound and determined to make it as a freelance war correspondent. So I was young, I was really ambitious, but I didn't have a lot of training. I had no experience, so you can imagine this was hard going for me. You see me on the screen here embedded with the Canadian military down in a very hot part of Afghanistan called Kandahar. Eventually, I was offered a real job in journalism, and this was going to take me to Baghdad, Iraq, which, if you're a 25-year-old wannabe war correspondent, that's the next probable destination. So I relocated there, spent about 8 months, really getting my chops as a journalist, and also always looking around the world at headlines for stories that were not being told. And I couldn't get my mind off of stories that were coming out of East Africa, particularly out of the country of Somalia. So if you don't know much about Somalia, it's a small country, one of the poorest in the world, a place that has been at war for most of the last 30 years, a place that is largely controlled by armed extremist groups, a place that women have very few rights. So I pitched this idea of going to Somalia, particularly the story of an impending food crisis, to the different news directors I was working with, all of whom were interested in the story, but I would be going as a freelancer. Well, I had done tons of freelance work in the other countries, so I was willing to assume that risk. And so I left Baghdad for Africa for what I thought was going to be 1 week. I first arrived in Kenya, which is the country that neighbors Somalia, and I was making all my preparations for this 1-week work trip, meanwhile emailing with my old friend Nige Brennan, my old Aussie photographer friend. He was not so far away, he was in London, and quite spontaneously I asked Nigel if he would like to join me on this work trip. He thought that could be a good opportunity for him as well as a journalist, and so I waited a few days for him, and once he arrived, together we boarded a small plane. We had plans for what we would do when we would come back 5 days later. We were going to go have a nice holiday on one of Kenya's beautiful white sand beaches. But as soon as our plane touched down in Mogadishu, I understood really quickly that what my journalist friends in Baghdad had told me about this place was right. This was a war zone that was pretty different than the other ones that I had been to. See, all those decades of war had left this country in a state of pretty much anarchy. The lack of an effective central government meant that most people, as you'll see on the screen here, had fled the city. The streets were almost completely empty as we drove from our airport to the hotel that we would be staying at. But in the parts of the city where we did find people, we saw sights like this, pickup trucks full of teenage boys holding AK-47s. I mean, these were things that I had not seen before, but there we were. We were in Mogadishu, and we were there to work. So we decided to keep to our itinerary. And on our third full day in the country, the Somali man who was organizing our logistics told us it was going to be a safe day to travel to an internally displaced people's camp where we had heard people were starving to death. And so Nigel and I got into an SUV vehicle that we had rented. We had 3 armed security guards with us. We also had 3 Somali journalist colleagues. We had my cameraman, a translator, and our driver. And we drove to this camp, leaving the capital city behind. We're driving along this highway road where there's almost no traffic. People are so poor in Somalia that they just can't afford cars. So when we saw a vehicle that was pulled over off to the side of the road up ahead, it did grab all of our attention. And then what unfolded was just like something out of your worst nightmare or a Hollywood movie. About a dozen armed men emerged from where they had been hiding behind that parked car. All of their faces were completely wrapped up in checkered scarves with only their eyes showing, but even so, I could tell that they were really young. Our vehicle was forced to stop. They surrounded it, they pulled our doors open, and they pulled us out. The next thing I knew, I was lying face down on the dirt with a gun held to the back of my head. A few minutes later, they told us to get back into our vehicle, only now one of these young men was at the wheel. And so we drove off with these guys, leaving our security behind. There was Nigel and I and our 3 colleagues, driven off into the desert by these masked men who said nothing by way of explanation to us. We drove for about an hour. A gun held to the back of my head the entire time, but I was in a state of shock. And so at a certain point, I turned around and I saw the young man who was holding the gun to my head. His face had become uncovered. And I found myself staring into the face of a boy whose name I would later learn was Ishmael, who had just celebrated his 14th birthday. So these teenagers, they took us that day to an abandoned house which was set out in the middle of the desert. Lots of these abandoned houses in a country like Somalia where so many people have fled the war. They shut Nigel and I up together inside a small, dirty, dark room, separated from our Somali colleagues who we would see very little of again. And we waited, Nigel and I, for someone to explain to us what was happening. We got our answer a couple of hours later when one of the leaders showed up. This man was a little older than the ones that had abducted us along the side of the road. He was a Somali man who spoke English quite well. He seemed to have an education, maybe traveled the world a little bit by the way he spoke. He certainly knew the value of these foreigners that he now had in his hands. So this man, who went by the name of Adam, demanded from Nigel and I our family's contact information. Of course, we didn't want to give it to this man, but we had no choice. And then later that day, Nigel's family here in Australia and my family at home in Canada received phone calls. The phone call to my family came in the middle of the night in Canada, so no one answered, and instead this man left a voicemail message for my dad, demanding $1.5 million for my life. Nigel's family received an identical phone call, and neither of our families had $3 million to bring us home. But this guy was telling us that if the money wasn't paid and was not paid quickly, that we were going to be killed. He was telling us that we would be beheaded. And somehow those first impossibly long days turned into the first weeks, which somehow became months. And we were moved around a lot. We were always moved around in the middle of the night, never being told what was happening. Sometimes we were blindfolded. Sometimes they would put heavy burlap sacks over our head. Certainly, we always knew that there was the possibility of death. Very soon after we were abducted, our kidnappers decided that they would change our names. So Nigel was given the name Noah, and they renamed me Amina, which was a name that I ended up living with for a very long time. Most of these boys were between the ages of 14 and 18 years old. These were young men who had never been to school. Some of them were orphans. I know at least 2 of them had terrible scarring on their bodies. One had been shot, one had been injured in the bomb blast that killed his entire family. And despite their lack of education, most of them spoke a bit of broken English. And they liked to practice it. I think they learned it from listening to the BBC radio. And they would tell us stories about their own lives, about what their journeys had been to becoming part of this kidnapping. And we heard really awful stories from these young people. I mean, we heard from them what life is like in these big camps. We heard stories from them of watching their own siblings die of hunger, of watching their families and their neighbors massacred around them. It was pretty obvious that all of these young people were brought up in a culture of war. I mean, they have grown up around guns and death and violence. And those young people, they live in a world where things like going to school or having a job opportunity, I mean, those are things that they can only dream about. So what happens is these extremist groups, these criminals, they go into these camps where these young people live, and they basically offer them a job. They pay them a couple of dollars a month. They give them a gun and they give them some training, but I think more importantly, what they give them is a sense of purpose and belonging, which every young person wants. And in the absence of school or other ways that we more commonly feel that, it becomes much less surprising then that so many young people in countries like Somalia ultimately end up joining these groups. But I would describe these young men as bright. They were curious. They would often ask us questions about where we came from. I'll never forget the day that one of my kidnappers, who was a 16-year-old boy named Hassam, came into Nigel and I's room that we were sharing. And after looking over his shoulder a couple of times and making sure that none of the others were going to hear him, he confided in us and he told us, "I don't like being a soldier. I want to be a student. I want to learn English." And it might sound totally bizarre to you that in that moment I felt something like sympathy for Hassam, but I actually did. Even though it was part of taking away my freedom, it just struck me as incredibly tragic that there are these parts of the world where young people have like a pretty simple dream of learning a language, bettering themselves, going to school, and yet it's impossible, and their destiny becomes something quite different. One day, several months in, Nigel and I were suddenly separated from each other. Just like that, they came into the room or the series of rooms that up until that point we had shared. They picked up Nigel's few belongings, which wasn't much, a change of clothes they had bought him and a tube of toothpaste, and they moved him into another room in the house. So we were in the same house, but we may as well have been in other countries because we had no ability to communicate with each other. In fact, they told us if we tried, we would be killed. And so just like that, I was alone. Like really alone for the first time in my life. I was just alone in this empty room with no electricity, with nothing to read and no one to talk to and nothing to do. I mean, just left alone with my own mind. And at that point in captivity, losing my mind, insanity was one of the things that I feared the most. But I was determined not to let that happen. And so I used to spend my days walking in circles around this room. And as I walked, I would use my imagination to launch me out of there. I would think about all the beauty of the world that I've been so lucky to see, and I would plan all the things that I was going to do with my life if I had another go at it. But time was passing, and I was becoming depressed and pretty desperate. So was Nigel. So we started to take really big risks to communicate with each other. We found that our kidnappers weren't paying that close attention to us anymore. There was always a dozen armed men there, but we were tucked in two separate rooms in the back of the house. We found that when I would have opportunity to use the bathroom and would have to walk past his room, we could exchange information, have very brief conversations. And it was during one of these conversations, we're now about 5 months in to the kidnapping, that Nigel and I started to talk about escape.